Hello everyone and welcome to Python for MATLAB Coders Part 3 Functions. I'm Arash and today I want to translate this piece of MATLAB code into Python. So as you can see here on the left, I have a MATLAB code in the standard MATLAB IDE, and on the right side I have opened Spider, which is a very useful IDE for Python. So here we basically want to work with functions. I have created 4 different functions with some little differences, and we want to see that how would be the translation of these codes into Python and what are the main differences. The first function I want to talk about is a very simple function that calculates the summation of 2 values. So here we want to calculate the summation of 3 and 5 and then display the result. The second one does the same job, but in this case we want to assume that we probably have forgotten to add the second variable. So we want to tell the function that if we have forgotten to add the second value, have something in default. So we use that default value instead of the second variable if we have missed it for any reason. And then we want to display the result. Also here, this third function we want to write is a function that simply has 2 outputs. So both we want to calculate the summation and product of 2 variables. And then we want to put that values inside Z1 and Z2. And then we want to print those values. And at the end, we want to write a function that have some nested functions inside it to do some housekeeping inside that function. So let's see how we can translate these codes into Python. But before we begin, let me run this code so you would see what would be the output. So the output of the first function is a summation of 3 and 5, which is 8. The second one does the same job, but this time we have assumed that the user has forgotten for any reason or didn't want to include the second number. As you can see here, we have used a narging command to count the number of input arguments, and if they are equal to 1, then we have this assumption or default value that y should be equal to 5. And then basically it does the same job as the previous function. So in the third function, as you can see here, we want to calculate both summation and product of 2 values. It would be a very simple function, something like this, and we want to see what would be the translation of this code in Python. And in the fourth section, we want to have some nested functions. So it means that we have this calc sum function and calc prod, which calculates the product of 2 values, and we want to define these functions inside a larger function. So it wouldn't be recognized outside of this function, but we can call them within. That would be also a very useful application if you're writing a large code that probably has different functions, and you do not want to have any mistake when you're working with name of these functions, because probably they could have been the same names in a large file. But using this approach by defining nested functions, you just make sure that when you're running your program, it will not go outside of this structure and it will not call any other function if they exist inside that function. So let's see what would be the translation of this code in Python. So let's begin with the definition of the main function. As you can see, this is one difference. So here in MATLAB we call function and then main, but here in Python we write DEF, which means definition, and then we call the name of the function and an empty parenthesis. It depends. If you have any inputs, you need to include them. And then we use a colon at the end of the line. So let's do for the part 1 and see what would be the result. So here we have this function z is equal to calc sum 3 and 5. That's okay. And then we want to print this value. That's okay. So also in part 2 we want to have this function that does the same summation job, but it just takes care of the absence of the second variable. So we just write it like we do it in MATLAB, and then we need to take care of it in the definition of that function. And in part 3 we want to have this function that has two outputs, summation and product of two variables. And then in part 4 we have this function that has some nested functions, smaller functions that they are nesting inside inside and within that larger function. And then we want to print the result. So this is our main function. And now let's go back to definition of each of these functions. If I hover the mouse on top of this cross signs, you can see that it gives me an error because calc sum has not been defined yet inside Python. So we need to take care of that. We defined calc sum. It takes two variables. As you can see here, is somehow similar to MATLAB syntax, but instead of function we use def and we add a colon at the end of the line, and then we do the simple operation. As you can see, z is equal to x plus y, which is the same in MATLAB. It doesn't matter if you add this semicolon or not in Python. If you do not want to add any code next after that piece of the code in the same line. So just notice the indentation that we have here when we define this function, and in MATLAB we do not need to have that indentation, but we just need to add end to tell the program that this is the end of the function. So we return this value of z to the main program. So when we call this calc sum, it will put the value of z inside this z here, as you can see here. They can have two different names, it doesn't matter, but it is better to make them be the same, so we wouldn't make any sort of mistakes when we are working with this sort of functions. Now let's go to part 2 and define a function that has a missing input parameter. So if we want to tell the program that assume that the second variable is equal to 5 if it was missing, we can simply do it in Python by saying y is equal to 5 when we are defining the function. It would make the life much more easier. As you can see, the code is much cleaner and shorter compared to the MATLAB version, as you can see here on the left side. So let's go to function 3. In function 3, we want to calculate summation and product of two variables. As you can see here, we can simply say z1 is equal to x plus y and z2 is x multiply y. And finally, we can return these two values, but separating them with a comma. So this would be a difference between Python and MATLAB. In Python, we explicitly here show that what would be the output of our function z1 and z2, but in Python, when we use return, it assumes that those values that are in front of the return command, they are the output of the function, and it will deliver those values back to the main program. So let's go to function 4. In this function, we want to create some nested variables. So by nested functions. So by nested functions, I mean that we want to define some functions that they just operate within this larger function and they are not recognizable outside this block. So we can define these functions like calc sum nested x and y. I just did that to make a difference from this function that we written in part 1. So we also defined the second function which calculates the product of these two values. So we can then return x and multiply y. And then finally, we can simply say that z1 is equal to calc some nested x and y, and z2 is equal to calc prod nested x and y. Yeah, this basically does the same job as the previous code, but in case that you want to do this operation several times inside your code, it will make the code much more cleaner if you use the nested functions. And the program will put a higher priority on the functions that are defined inside that block compared to the functions that they are defined outside of that block when you want to run the code. So at the end, we need to add main and empty parentheses, as you can see, but in MATLAB, we do not need to do that because by default, MATLAB assumes that the first function that we define is the main function. But in Python, we need to explicitly say to the program that main is our main function and we want to execute it when the script is running. So if I run this code, you can see that the outputs would be the same, 8, 8, 8, and 15. So this piece of code on the right does have the same functionality as the code in MATLAB on the left. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope that this video have been useful for you. I hope to see you in the next videos. And also, if you need to have access to the codes, you can find it in the description of the video. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.